Okay, so we're going to touch on microevolution and look at that for a little bit today. So microevolution is really looking at this idea of evolution on that microscopic scale or that smaller scale. Okay, so this is the idea when we're looking at this generation to generation changes in allele or genotypic frequencies in a population. So this is really looking at how evolution occurs on a genetic level. And this often involves really small or minor changes over a few generations. So we're not looking at big phenotypic changes. We're looking at these small microscopic allelic frequency changes. All right, and this is really what Hardy-Weinberg and that idea of the Hardy-Weinberg equation, this is really what we're trying to look at using that equation to see if a population is changing over time or not. All right, so thinking about Hardy-Weinberg, we know that there are 5 conditions for Hardy-Weinberg. And really, they're based on things that are factors driving evolution. So the factors that drive evolution include non-random mating, mutations, genetic drift, migration, and natural selection. Okay, so these are things that are going to cause evolution to happen. So we know in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the idea is that evolution is not happening. So this is essentially, in order for evolution to not occur, none of these factors can happen. So on the flip side of this, in Hardy-Weinberg, there has to be random mating. There can be no selection. There can be no mutations. There can be no genetic drift, which we'll talk about later on. There can be no migration and no natural selection. So those are the ideas behind Hardy-Weinberg conditions and why we say those are the conditions to maintain equilibrium, because these are the 5 things that are going to drive evolution and cause organisms, their allele frequencies to change over time. All right, so don't forget, once again, as you're going through these notes, that I really recommend that you pause and write down what's on the slide and what's on your note sheets, and then go back in and add some of those things that I talk about along the way. Because especially on your video quizzes, don't be surprised if the things that are on your video quiz are things that I talk about, and maybe some of those examples and things that you maybe didn't necessarily write down word for word on your slide, but I'm asking you to kind of make sure you're paying attention to that as well. All right. So the first thing that we're looking at here is this idea of non-random mating. So non-random mating is something that is going to drive evolution to occur. So an example of this is when we see sexual selection, or what we also call assortative mating. All right, so this is when selecting mates is based on phenotype in some way. So some examples of this include male competition, and then female choice is a big thing as well. All right, so male competition, you can see these lions fighting for dominance here to try to fight and get the lady, right? So that's something, the selection is going to be based on phenotype, because it's basically going to be which lion is strongest, right? Which lion is the most dominant. So it's going to be based on their phenotype. And then female choice, on the other hand, so we've got this peacock here. So it's got these brightly colored feathers, and it's a big thing in nature, especially that females like there, is that they really are attracted to brightly colored males. So the brighter your plumage, if you happen to be a peacock, the more likely you are to get a female. All right, so that's going to influence which individuals are going to not only be able to survive, but what else? All right, we know they're going to also be able to reproduce more if they have a phenotype that's more favorable to sexual selection, right? So if females are more likely to pick them, or they're more likely to win the competition for the female. All right, so our next thing that can drive evolution is mutation. All right, mutation is an unpredictable change in the DNA. And mutations are going to drive evolution because they introduce new varieties to the population. This is how we get new alleles. This is how we get new options for phenotypes, is because of mutations. And mutations can occur in one of three ways. So one of the ways that we can see mutations is through a change in the nucleotide base pairs of a gene. So maybe we had an A, we had an adenine, and maybe it changed to thymine. All right, that's considered a mutation. So that's on the gene level. Another thing that can happen is that we can have chromosomes being rearranged. All right, so genes, so sections of directions for building something, they can move places or do different things. We'll talk more about the different types of mutations later on. And the last thing is sometimes chromosomes change structure, right? So sometimes that change in chromosome structure can lead to a mutation. All right, so we know another thing with mutations is sometimes these mutations aren't passed on. So it may be something that there's a mutation, but it won't be inherited unless it's in a gamete or a reproductive cell. Anytime you have mutations in body cells or somatic cells, those don't get passed on to your offspring because you're not passing on body cells to your offspring. You're passing on those sex cells or the gametes. Okay, so not all mutations end up being inherited. All right. So this next idea is called genetic drift. And this is looking at the effect of chance events on evolution. All right, so sometimes evolution is influenced just by randomness. So this is the idea that we have random changes in those allele frequencies in the population because of some change in the environment. There's not really a driving force behind it like we see in natural selection, where natural selection is favoring the most fit phenotype. This is just random. So what happens here is because there's a change in the environment, something occurs, and we'll talk about some examples of this. And so that the next generation, this new gene pool, is not going to be a representation of the original parent gene pool. So we've seen changes in allele frequencies because of some random event. This is more likely to impact small populations. So this is why in Hardy-Weinberg, one of the conditions for Hardy-Weinberg is that there's a large population. When you have a large population, it's less likely to have an impact when there's these random environmental things that happen. All right, so when this happens, because you have new gene pools that aren't representative of your original gene pool, this is going to increase variation between different populations. So if we have bugs that this has happened to, we see this shift in allele frequencies. Now it's going to be even more different than a bug population nearby. Okay, I'm going to pause and just so we can go to the next one.